Hey everyone, welcome to a MassTransit Commute. Today I'm going to talk about dependencies on endpoints. So one of the new features added in 8.0.15 is the ability to define a dependency on an endpoint. And the purpose of this is to allow something like a request client or some way to load configuration from another service. And that might be like cache data, things like that, and make sure that that data is available before the receive endpoint starts. So to do that, I've created a simple warehouse example. And what this does is it has an inquiry consumer, which handles inquiries from, this is our service that we actually want to expose. And it uses this configuration cache to get details about the warehouse. So it's like, if they say get the warehouse location number, I want to respond with the warehouse location number from that configuration cache. Now, iConfiguration cache is pretty simple. It right now is not doing a whole lot, but it's just saying it has a try-set configuration method where it sets the configuration and then completes that task since it's an awaitable thing. Now, this is an iReceive endpoint dependency, which is a new interface. And this allows it to be added to an endpoint as a dependency. So let's look at where this try-set configuration is called. What we have right now is a worker within our worker application that starts up after mass transit. And what that worker does is it will come up, it will create a scope, which because you have to have a scope to use the request client. It will then use the request client to send a request called get warehouse configuration, and then get that response warehouse configuration, and then call try set on that configuration. Now, the handler for that is a configuration consumer, which right now does a really expensive database call and then responds with the warehouse configuration. This could be anything you want. It could be tenant information. It could be data needed by the other consumers that you want to make sure is available. And you don't want those consumers to start processing messages until that data is available. So preloading a cache is a pretty good example use case for this feature. Now to configure this, I've added my configuration cache to the container as well as the interface. And I'm using kebab case. I'm adding the consumer configuration consumer because normally this would be in a separate service, but we're going to keep it simple. We're going to all put it right here. And then I'm going to have my inquiry consumer, which is my actual business case. Now I've added a configure endpoints callback. And the reason I've added that is because I want to add that configuration cache dependency to all of the receive endpoints on this that are configured by configure endpoints, which is going to be that inquiry consumer. Now, again, because I've sort of hacked this up, I'm going to explicitly define the receive endpoint for the configuration consumer because I want that to be up and running and I don't want that to wait. Normally this would be in another service, but I put it here. And this also kind of shows how when you're configuring a receive endpoint manually, you can configure the consumer, taking it out of the list of endpoints that'll be configured by configure endpoints. But also because I'm configuring it manually, it will not call the configure endpoints callback because this is only called for endpoints configured by configure endpoint. So here I'm going to set up a few host options. I'm going to tell it I don't want to wait until the bus is started because obviously I'm going to be doing processing before the bus is completely started up in that subsequent worker service. I'm going to have a start timeout of 20 seconds. And if I don't get the response and get the bus up and running in 20 seconds, it will fail the process, I think. And then I have a stop timeout, consumer top timeout. I tell the .NET host, wait 60 seconds to shut down, otherwise it kills everything very ceremoniously. Again, that's that worker that's going to run at startup. And then the configuration consumer, as we said, is just a dumb service. So what you'll see when I run this is when I go ahead and hit run, we're going to see it come up. It's going to configure those two endpoints. It's going to configure all of the broker topology, and then you see it waiting. It's waiting that 8 seconds for that request to respond. Then after that response comes in and we see that I get that configuration data of warehouse ID, then you see that the consumer inquiry is ready and the endpoint is ready because it didn't actually start that consumer and begin consuming from that inquiry queue until after that configuration was received and that dependency was satisfied, allowing that endpoint to start up. And it's important to look at the order of operations here. So all of the broker topologies, such as the inquiry exchange, the contracts bound to that endpoint, all of that stuff is configured at bus startup. And that's important because we want those messages to flow to that endpoint. We just don't want it to actually start consuming those messages from the broker to the endpoint until we've approved or satisfied that dependency. So that's kind of one of the new features. I think it's pretty cool. It was definitely requested by a customer, so we were fortunate enough to get that put in there. You can also have endpoints dependent upon other endpoints. So if you have like certain sagas that you need to have up before you start consuming messages, like the job service uses this to make sure the job service sagas are up and running before the job consumer endpoints are running. So it allows you to do some of those things to make sure that certain things are up and running first so that they don't miss messages, so on and so forth. Getting that topology bound and created and configured is super important. And having that up and running before you start processing data can eliminate some weird timing errors when you're deploying to a new empty broker. So hopefully you found this useful. Definitely check out the other videos on the channel, and we'll catch you next time.